Did you know there's over 10,000 life-changing injuries in the US alone each year involving table saws? However, when used correctly, the table saw can be one of the most versatile tools at your disposal. So today we're going to take you through everything you need to know to make you competent at the most common cuts and, more importantly, keep you safe. For today's demonstration, we're going to be using the Evolution RAGE5-S. This is because it's one of the most popular saws for beginners and hobbyists in the UK and abroad. What are the main components of the saw and what are their functions? At the rear of the machine we have the dust extraction port. It's advisable to be using dust extraction whenever possible because this is beneficial to your health. It also reduces maintenance over time because it prevents sap and sawdust building up within the working parts of the machine. Below there we have the stand, which is pretty unique to Evolution. The stand makes it foldable, portable and a stable platform to work on. On the left hand side we have storage for two spanners which are used for changing the blade and adjusting the riving knife. In front of the saw we have the on and off switch. Here we have the height adjustment wheel. This also operates the angle of adjustment simply by undoing this catch, pressing in on the wheel and rotating to the desired angle and then locking back into position with this catch. Looking in at the top of the table saw, working from the outside in, we have the side extension wings. These give a greater amount of support to larger workpieces, and again these are quite unique to the Evolution table saw. Next we have the rip fence, the auxiliary rip fence and rip fence locking lever. Next we have the crown guard and dust extraction port. The purpose of the crown guard is to stop objects, whether that be your hand or wood, falling onto the blade. Below the crown guard we have the blade, and to the rear of the blade we have the splitter or riving knife. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, as this is the most important safety device on the table saw. We then have the throat plate or table insert plate. Lastly, we've got the miter gauge. The miter gauge is used for cross cuts. And what I like about this one best is you can use it as a standard miter gauge, like so, or you can lock it in position and you can use it in conjunction with the sliding carriage. This gives extra support on the infeed through to the outfeed. I've removed the crown guard so we can take a closer look at the riving knife. The riving knife's primary function is to stop timber from pinching onto the blade. If this happens, the timber can be thrown back at the user. But it also doesn't just throw it back at the user, it can drag it into the blade. So if you're not using a push stick when pushing your timber through, your hand can be dragged into the blade as well, causing a catastrophic injury. The riving knife on the Evolution table saw can be raised and lowered depending on what type of cut you're going to make, so you should never need to remove it. To set the machine up for its initial use, we're just going to talk a little bit about clothing. You don't want any loose fitting or baggy clothing on, such as hoodies, things with long tassels, baggy sleeves, anything that can get caught in the machine. You don't want any jewellery, bracelets, necklaces, even rings. Once when I was in the army, somebody had an accident in one of the vehicles I was on and they had a ring on and literally the full finger got stripped off, so you don't even want tight fitting jewellery on, such as rings. Also gloves, you shouldn't be wearing gloves when operating machinery at all. This reduces the sensation that you get and the feedback you get from the machine, and also if that catches onto any of the material it can drag your hand in there. And lastly, if you've got long hair you should have that tied back. We're now going to set the machine up for its first cut. So we're switched off at the wall and we've got our dust extraction fitted ready. I'm going to make sure that the rip fence is parallel to the blade and the blade is square to the table. The first thing we're going to do is make sure that the rip fence is parallel to the blade. So we'll start by removing the crown guard. I'm going to unlock the fence and I'm going to slide it over to the miter gauge slot. I'm going to lock it in position, and the gap should be the same between the fence and the miter gauge slot. You can see we've got about 3mm gap here, and as you wear down the bottom of the fence we've got 0 here. So what we need to do now is start off by undoing these two bolts here. And once you've done it once, you shouldn't really need to do it again, but it's something that you'll check periodically on your maintenance. So I've undone these two bolts here. I'm going to release the handle at the back, and as you can see it's sprung into position. All I'm going to do is slide it back over, make it so the gap at the front and at the rear are exactly the same, in line with the miter gauge. Hold the fence in position and lock it down. and then tighten these back up. If you don't do this, you've got an increased risk of kickback, especially if the fence is angled in towards the blade. So I'll just test that, slide it across to the insert plate, lock it down, and I can see the gap now is the same all the way along. We're then going to make sure that the blade is square to the table. And we can do this by using an engineer's square and just placing it up to the blade, making sure it's not touching any of the teeth, and then looking down the line of the square and making sure there's no daylight coming in between the blade and the square. If it's touching on one of the teeth, you'll see daylight all the way down, that'll give you a false reading. You can also do this by using one of these digital angle finders, and this is my preferred method. What you do with this is, you just switch it on, press the 0 button, once it's zeroed, pop it onto the side for the blade, and then simply adjust the blade until you're at 90 degrees or your desired angle. Like so. I do apologise if you can hear the drums from above. There is a tosser upstairs playing the drums as loud as he can, which is putting me off a little bit. But now what we're going to do is talk about body placement. So we want to be stood just to the left hand side of the blade. This is in case, in worst case scenario, we have kickback, that we are out of the direct firing line of it. Just to the left hand side of the blade, close enough that we can control the timber, but also we don't want to be reaching over the blade at any time. Now let's talk about how to feed the timber through the machine, direction of force, and how to hold it. So with your lead hand, you want to be applying a downward pressure with your thumb. Your forefinger wants to be applying pressure into the fence. The rear hand is to support the timber. A common mistake what beginners make is, as they're feeding the timber into the saw, the timber will rise like so. So the backhand is keeping that balanced nice and flat. Just to reiterate that. Up to the fence with the forefinger pushing in to the fence. Thumb pushing down, applying downward pressure, light downward pressure. And then the rear hand is to feed the timber through the machine. The lead hand should never move forward and follow the timber. The rear hand pushes the timber into the machine. When the lead hand reaches the front of the machine, you're going to reach for your push stick. While reaching for the push stick, make sure that the lead hand is keeping downward pressure and inward pressure at all times. Never let go of the timber. Reach for your push stick. Apply the push stick 2/3 along the timber, not too close to the rip fence. If it's too close to the rip fence, the timber can twist and bind, causing kickback. So closer to the blade is better, but just make sure that you don't hit the crown guard. Push the timber all the way through the blade and beyond until it passes through the table saw. Any offcuts, do not reach to grab them. Leave it until the saw fully stops, and then you can remove any offcuts. Now we're going to be moving on to the cross cuts, and for that we need the miter gauge. First thing we need to do is get a framing square and make sure that the miter gauge, when set at 0, is square to the blade. So I'll place the framing square onto the bed of the table saw, pull it up to the miter gauge, slide it over to the blade, making sure that there's no gaps in between the miter gauge and the table saw blade. I've got a little gap there, so I'm just going to tweak this slightly. Just recheck again. Perfect. What's great about this miter gauge as well on the Evolution table saw is you can use it as a standard miter gauge, like so. But you can see here the distance between the fence and the blade isn't that substantial. So what you can do with this one is you can unlock the table, lock the miter gauge into position, and it actually has a sliding bed. Which gives you a huge amount of support on the infeed and on the outfeed. A great feature. Just a quick warning before we do start, never use the rip fence in conjunction with a miter gauge. Your workpiece will be wider than it is long. And when you pass it through the blade, it's got a high probability of getting trapped in between the fence and the blade and twisting, causing kickback. So you must never use the rip fence in conjunction with the miter gauge. If you need to make repeatable cuts, simply attach a block of wood to your fence, set your fence where you need it, and then move your timber up to your block of wood, and the block of wood is before the blade. So when you pass it through, we've now got clearance between the timber and the fence, so nothing's going to get trapped. The miter gauge, as it states in the name then, can also cut miters. So we're going to move this over to 45 degrees, lock it in position. Really important that you do use the clamp when you're making, especially when you're making miter cuts with the miter gauge on a table saw. Because of the direction that the blade is spinning, it wants to grab hold of the wood and pull it towards you. This is obviously quite dangerous, and it's going to make inaccuracies in your cuts. Today we've covered the fundamental practices when using a table saw, including rip cuts and cross cuts, and some of the most important safety features and safety practices. So I hope you took something away from today, and hopefully it's going to make you a more competent and safer user. I'd also like to say thank you to Evolution for providing me with the saw, and I'll put a link to Evolution's website in the description below, and I'll also pop now on screen a promo code so you can get 5% off. Also, thank you to my Patreon and channel membership supporters. Your support is really appreciated, and if you'd like to support us, you can do that over on Patreon and channel membership. Right, I'll see you on the next video, guys. Bye bye.